I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1713 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. I don't know about you. I am sick and tired of hearing about the coronavirus and how it may wipe out mankind from the face of the earth. That's all you hear on the news. That's all you can see in a newspaper or any other news source you may have. Because I'm tired of it, in this episode, I decided to share with you something totally unrelated to the coronavirus, and that just happens to be everybody's favorite, the old faithful M551 Sheridan tank. It was used very effectively in the Vietnam War. I first heard of the M551 Sheridan when I was a brand new second lieutenant with the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina in 1966. Of course, I was new. I didn't know anything. People were saying, finally, we're getting some armor in this division. I didn't know anything about armor in the division, so I thought it must be pretty good. Everybody's all excited about it. I never did see one before I left there and went over to Vietnam, but I heard about it first, right there at Fort Bragg in the 82nd Airborne Division. Lo and behold, a story about the M551 Sheridan tank popped up right there on the Sputnik News website. And I'm going to share it with you, just to help you stamp out ignorance about another tank that was used in the Vietnam War. They had them in the Americal Division, up north, where I spent some time. These tanks were lighter and fast. They could move about 45 miles an hour down Highway 1 and do a good job on the enemy. This tank had a few drawbacks, which they're going to discuss in this story, but overall, it was a good addition to our military. The story I'm going to share with you is titled, The Tank That Dropped from the Sky, the story of the U.S. Army's M551 Sheridan tank. Whoever wrote this story didn't think enough of it to put their name on it, so we don't know who wrote it. All I know is it came from the SputnikNews.com website. Right now, let's take a look at this very informing and interesting story about one of our tanks used in Vietnam. Dateline, SputnikNews.com. While proving useful in 3 wars, the Vietnam War, Operation Just Cause in Panama, and the Persian Gulf War in Kuwait, the M551 Sheridan light tank has gone down in history as troublesome in action, despite being an innovative weapon systems. Personally, I think they tried to get too technical with it, and that's what got in its way of being a great addition to our military arsenal. The M551 Sheridan light tank, developed by the United States and named after General Philip Sheridan, the Union cavalry general of the Civil War, who liked to burn down houses and barns. Albeit with a set of troublesome failures, left a gaping hole in the Army once it was retired without replacement in 1966. Here are some of the reasons why. M551 Sheridan Armored Reconnaissance Airborne Assault Vehicle was a light tank developed when the U.S. Army was stepping away from the concept of light tanks in favor of the main battle tank, writes the National Interest. However, as the main battle Patton tanks at the time still had speeds of no more than around 30 miles per hour, divisions required a light tank that could be airlifted to offer mobile anti-tank weaponry to counter attacks on airborne troops after a parachute drop. The German airborne troops that jumped into the island of Crete during World War II probably would have appreciated having a few of these tanks with them. They took such a beating that Hitler stopped using airborne operations after that. That's another reason they decided to develop the M551 Sheridan. Back to the story. Thus, the Army invested $1.3 billion in the M551 Sheridan, with over 1,562 of them produced between 1966 and 1970. The Sheridan entered service at the insistence of General Creighton Abrams, the U.S. commander of military forces in South Vietnam at the time. The tank saw combat service in Vietnam in January 1969, replacing heavier and slower M48 Patton tanks, while in April and August of 1969 the tanks were deployed to units in Europe and South Korea. The Sheridans also saw limited service in Operation Just Cause in Panama and the Persian Gulf War in Kuwait. Designed to be landed by parachute and to swim across rivers, the tank weighed 15 tons with a top speed of 43 miles per hour. Richard Petty probably liked that feature. The Sheridan accommodated a crew of 4 in an armored steel turret and aluminum hull, and could make river crossings at 3 miles per hour due to a hinged flotation screen that could be extended from the top of the hull. This could be opened up into a sloping vertical surface in front of the driver, in the manner of a boat hull bow, about level with the top of the turret. The remainder of the water barrier was of fabric folding up from compartments lining the upper corner. The tank's light weight and high mobility were tremendous advantages, as it did not get stuck in the mud as often as the 52-ton M48 Patton tanks were wont to do. The troublesome gun. I noticed that the gun on this tank was a short little thing. It looked like a little short, fat pig hung on the front of the turret. The Sheridan tank's most striking feature was its technically advanced but troublesome M81 modified M81E1 152mm gun launcher, which could fire both conventional ammunition and the newly developed M551 Sheridan guided anti-tank missile. Love those anti-tank missiles. Each Sheridan tank was fitted with 9 Sherilans and 20 shells as standard, as well as 50 caliber and 7.62 millimeter machine guns mounted on the turret and hull, respectively. Although it could fire huge caseless shells that carried more of a punch to infantry than the 90 or 105 millimeter shells fired by Patton tanks, the short-barreled gun was found lacking in muzzle velocity. There's nothing worse in combat to lack muzzle velocity. That was my comment. This meant it could not provide accuracy at long ranges. A undecipherable word, heavy tank armor through kinetic energy, was also a problem. When used at medium or long range, the gun launched the MGM-151 Sheridan anti-tank missile at targets up to 2 or 3 kilometers away. That is a long way. It's almost 2 miles. Another serious deficiency was the gun had too much recoil for the vehicle's light frame. At times, the second and even third road wheels would leap up off the ground after a shot from the heavy main gun. The motion was criticized. The motion was criticized for potentially causing chest injuries to the commander if he was peering over the hatch. Pardon me, that just seemed to be a little... The missile system's electronics similarly suffered in the recoil. No kidding. Another issue was the partially automated loading system. This reduced the gun's rate of fire to some 2 rounds per minute. By comparison, the crew of an M48 tank could potentially fire around a dozen 90mm shells. Let's see. The M551 could fire 2 rounds per minute, and the cumbersome M48 Patton tanks could fire 12 rounds per minute. The Sheridan's caseless 152mm main gun rounds with loose propellant were also a potential safety hazard. In cases when the warhead separated from the propellant during loading, the unspent charges remained on the turret floor. That means the crew had to cut down on their smoking. Can you imagine some of that propellant just laying on the floor, catches on fire? That would be no fun. Flawed survivability. You mean there's even worse problems with it? The Sheridan light tank's main shortcomings was its poor survivability, as its armor was vulnerable to landmines and rocket-propelled grenades. That's no fun. It seems like every VC and NVA soldier in Vietnam had an RPG. In truth, it was not intended to repel anything heavier than a heavy machine gun round. That would not give the crew a lot of confidence in surviving a battle. Besides the flammable aluminum hulls, the Sheridan's caseless 152mm shells rendered it vulnerable to detonating when the vehicle was penetrated. These features resulted in a low crew survival rate. That would be a very discouraging item to get over when you're trying to get people to volunteer to crew an M551. The MGM-151 Sheridan anti-tank missiles manifested numerous technical faults, with its infrared sensor unable to lock onto targets closer to 800 meters. Despite all these minor shortcomings, the Sheridan tank was reportedly well liked by the troops despite the criticism it endured from senior officers. The crews probably liked them because they could outrun the M48s. As the last armored cavalry regiments were withdrawn in 1972 from Vietnam, the Sheridan tank completed its service in that little country far, far away, with the Army starting to phase out the vehicle by the late 1970s. Nonetheless, as upgraded models, the M551A1 TTS with thermal sight for night combat remained in service with airborne formations, and in 1989 the Sheridans of the 3rd Battalion of the 73rd Armored were used in the first and only parachute drop of U.S. tanks into combat by C-130 transports onto Torrijos Tocumen airfield in Panama during Operation Just Cause. A year later, 51 Sheridans were deployed to Saudi Arabia with the 82nd Airborne Division as part of Operation Desert Shield. As part of the 82nd Airborne's Rapid Reaction Force, the Sheridans remained in U.S. service until being retired in 1996. There was never a replacement for the Sheridan tank in the airborne branch, as currently modern anti-tank missiles such as the Javelin are deemed better for anti-tank defense of airborne troops than a light tank vulnerable to anti-armor return fire, despite its effective infantry support in the face of small arms and light support weapons. That said, as its history shows, the Sheridan tank was appreciated for being in the right place at the right time. Hear, hear, and thank goodness for the M551 Sheridan tank. It did a good job, but time has passed it by. All those effective anti-tank weapons are putting the Sheridan out to pasture, which is probably a good idea when you consider the fate of the crews when they were in combat. There you have the story of the U.S. Army's M551 Sheridan tank, named after a barn burner from the Civil War. I hope you've enjoyed this little break from the constant coronavirus news stream. Hope you enjoyed this. Thank you for listening. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1713 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
If you like what you hear, then go tell someone. How about that? Ain't that a mess?